Hey everyone, welcome back to another GRE video. We are continuing today on verbal discrete questions, which are the questions that basically test your vocabulary in the verbal section. The question we're looking at today is medium double blank. What I want you to keep in mind before we jump into the example is that you want to consider the connotation of different words that are used. So when you're studying vocabulary, also, make note of any time the dictionary says especially when or particularly in cases of blank. Connotation is a feeling or an association that is added in addition to the literal meaning of a word. That is basically to say that some words we use exclusively in a positive context, some we use exclusively in a negative context, and some can be used in both. And understanding that is part of knowing what answer choices are best. I have a short list of really common positive and negative words, and you can see here an aroma versus a stench when you're talking about a smell is quite different, and the feeling that you get is very, very different. We have confident versus cocky. One is definitely a positive trait and the other one turns you off immediately. We have vintage versus outdated to talk about something old. We have collaboration, which is something positive, versus collusion, which immediately gives you really sneaky vibes where somebody's trying to hide something. Passionate versus emotionally unstable, plan versus scheme, juvenile versus youthful. So as you can see, some of these words can be both verbs and adjectives, but sometimes you can have nouns as well, and that is just part of a word's meaning, so make sure you pay attention. I also want you to note specifically when looking through these types of questions is that sometimes you have to work backwards. So ask yourself, what information are you given in the sentence? A lot of times you might see your blank in the first part of your sentence and the information to help find the answer in the second half, and you have to work backwards that way, which can be a little bit counterintuitive. And when you have multiple blanks, like we'll see in this question, you want to understand how the different blanks relate to the information that's given. So how do we know what information helps us answer the question and what information is that? Those are things that you want to keep in mind. The example question we have is this: political advertising may well be the most blank kind of advertising. Political candidates are usually quite blank, yet their campaign advertisements often hide important differences behind smoke screens of smiles and empty slogans. Feel free to pause and read that again if you need, but let's break this down a little bit. So first, you can see that just by looking at the first part of the sentence here, it really doesn't give us much information. So political advertising is very blank. We know that here, when we have the colon, the information that comes after the colon describes the information that comes before the colon. So anytime you see a colon used, and this is something that you should know about punctuation, is you make a claim, you have a colon, and the information after the claim provides evidence or support somehow. We need to rely on the second half of the sentence to tell us what the first blank is. And looking at the second half of the sentence, we also see this transition word, yet. So remember in a previous video, I talked about different transition words meaning different things. Here, yet is drawing a contrast between what comes before it and what comes after it. So in this case, whatever goes in the second blank is going to be in contrast to what is being described in the very last section of the sentence. Another thing to keep in mind here is some of the language that's being used. Here we're talking about campaign campaign advertisements hiding important differences between smoke screens of smiles and empty slogans. When you think about the word and the phrase smoke screens, you might think about something like magicians trying to fool you, trying to make you not see something that would give away the trick, or to hide the truth in some way. This is the connotation of smoke screens. So that helps inform the kind of feeling that this sentence is trying to describe. What we want to do is take a look at the different relationships between each of these blanks just to make sure that it's very clear. Just like I mentioned before, we're focusing on this idea of hiding important differences behind smoke screens. So that is one of the main ideas of this sentence, and that informs what we are going to put in blank 2. We're looking at something that is in contrast to hiding important differences because we have that transition word yet that I mentioned before. We have political candidates usually being very blank, but their advertisements are hiding important differences. So that gives us some insight into what to put in blank 2. And then, because of the colon that I mentioned earlier, that then tells us what might go in blank 1. So this is one of those questions where the blanks sort of lay on each other. So it's very important that you understand the relationship between them because you really need both of them to answer the question. To look at everything, basically the latter part of the sentence informs the former part of the sentence. And for each of the answer choices, we have polemical, effective, and deceptive for blank 1, interchangeable, dissimilar, and vocal for blank 2. Because we need blank 2 to answer blank 1, let's start with that one first. So, reading it again, political candidates are usually quite blank, yet their campaign advertisements often hide important differences behind smokescreens of smiles and empty slogans. So we have a contrast of hiding important differences and these political candidates themselves. So the advertisements are misleading, they hide these differences, they cover up something that we should know, and the reason is that political candidates themselves are usually quite dissimilar, they're quite different. So this makes sense if you think about the key transition word yet, because you're drawing a contrast between the candidates themselves, which are quite different, and the advertisements that hide these differences behind smoke screens of smiles and empty slogans. And this is something that a lot of people feel when thinking about political leaders is they're not actually telling the truth most of the time. If our political candidates are very dissimilar and yet their advertisements are completely hiding that fact, it's probably something that we don't like very much and that's not very popular. So looking at the answer choices for blank 1 again, we have polemical, effective, and deceptive. So if you're unfamiliar, polemical means controversial, but in this case, controversy doesn't really have a negative connotation. It just means that something is controversial, not necessarily in a good way or a bad way. That does make sense. Political advertising might be controversial, but here the sentence is really trying to highlight that the candidates are quite dissimilar from each other, but their advertisements are trying to hide those differences. So we're highlighting this idea of hiding differences, of being dishonest. So polemical doesn't make the most sense in that context. We also have effective, but we're really not talking about effectiveness of advertisements. We're really talking about how deceptive they are, about how these advertisements are used to really cover up the true issues, to really cover up the true differences between candidates. And that's why deceptive is the correct answer here. Reading it again, political advertising may well be the most deceptive kind of advertising. Political candidates are usually quite dissimilar, yet their campaign advertisements often hide important differences behind smokescreens of smiles and empty slogans. So we have the highlighting of the important differences actually existing, but the advertising does not reflect that. Just as a recap, make sure you understand and are considering the connotations of different words. And this is just a short list of words that have these connotations. When you're studying vocabulary, try to keep that in mind. You will also sometimes have to work backwards, just like we did in this one, where the information is given in the second half of the sentence, and you have to sort of work your way backwards twice to get the right answer for each blank. Don't be afraid to consider the whole sentence as a unit and look at the second blank first to help you answer the first one. If you're looking for more information on how you can actually implement these tips and tricks into getting a better score on your GRE, please visit AliceChenGRE.com. I have more information about what it's like to work with me. For example, that I was patient and kind, I explained things to Sarah thoroughly and offered examples and tips. With Joshua, I gave him a better understanding of what he should work on to get over that 150 score that he was aiming for. I have more information about how private GRE tutoring works with me. For example, you can choose between writing, quantitative, and/or the verbal section. I will give you a customized study plan with session agendas for each time we meet. I can provide sample questions, different study resources, do a content review, go over strategies and examples with you, and as always, I offer flexible payment and scheduling options. Thanks so much for watching!